Welcome to Psych Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jessica Rabin, a licensed clinical psychologist. If you are a mental health professional, student in the social science field, or just interested in psychology and mental health, this podcast is for you. Although topics discussed on this podcast are similar to therapy, Psych Talk is not a replacement for therapy and is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So let's dive into today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to Psych Talk, and thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Today I have a very special guest with me, Jenny Chan, who is the co-founder of Pacific Atrocities Education. So Jenny, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I am very excited to have our conversation today. I know I'm going to learn so much from you, but before we dive into that conversation, can you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, what you do, and anything else you want to share?
Yeah, so I am the co-founder of Pacific Atrocities Education. I co-founded this organization because I realized that there's this bridge, there's this gap of knowledge between like what had happened in World War II in the West and also what had happened in the East. And I we have been scanning like a million pages of documents from the National Archives. We've been doing oral history, like we've been collecting oral history from people who have survived the war, and just working with educators on lesson plans, as well as having our internship research program that is really dedicated to researching this part of history.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, we'll obviously be talking more about what you do throughout the conversation. And you just gave a really great overview of what Pacific Atrocities Education is, what inspired you to really co-found it. Is there anything else that you all are doing or about Pacific Atrocities Education that you would like to share with listeners before we dive into the main bulk of our conversation?
Yeah, we also have a YouTube channel, Pacific Front Untold, where we talk about a lot of the hidden um, trauma and really atrocities that have happened in the East. Um, and we try to make it as relatable as possible, so it's not like just some boring history that people will just fall asleep to.
Yeah. No, I love that because I will fully admit that I did not pay attention in most of my histories classes because I did feel like it was just boring. So I love that you make it engaging in hopes
Yeah.
that people don't fall asleep to it.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I also used to fall asleep in history class. My degree was not in history per se. My degree was actually in economics and statistics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and after like my grandma passed away, I we found this like box of like military yen and all this like rice rationing coupons, like
Mm,
with her belongings. And
yeah.
I started then questioning, like, because I remember my grandma, like, really hating on the Japanese. Like, whenever I watch anime, she'll be like, oh, that's really like brain rot content, blah, blah, blah. Those people are
Hmm.
evil. And I had no idea why she was saying that, you know. And then it wasn't until she passed away, and then I had this really boring job. And so after work, I had a lot of time to read. And I didn't
Okay.
really like watching TV. And then I was like diving into pages of like Rape of Nanking and also like The Rising Sun. And then
Hmm.
I started realizing like there's like a huge gap of how we tell history,
Hmm.
especially in like the West. I grew up in the United States. I had only learned about like Hitler, and we
Yeah.
watched like this movie on Pearl Harbor,
Yep.
and I had always and I didn't realize that what my grandma suffered was like in the same war as Pearl Harbor until I
Yeah.
started reading like John Toland's like book on it. I'm like, oh, so when she's describing the Japanese, it's the same Japanese that occupy Hong Kong and the same Japanese that did Pearl Harbor. And so
Hmm.
then that kind of connected to me in like a mental like bridge. And
Yeah.
then I was like, oh, maybe I can find a job as an analyst in some kind of nonprofit that is related
Hmm.
to this. And I couldn't find any nonprofit related to like World War II in Asia
Hmm.
Pacific. Even though that, like, if you think about it, it's like 30 million, that's like the lower estimate of like how
Okay.
many people died during World War II in Asia. And yeah, and like the high estimate is like 42 million.
Wow.
And like people, and I couldn't find any like organization around this kind of topic. And so, yeah, that's how I co-founded the organization.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And I love hearing people's journeys of like where they started and where they ended up. And I love that you're like, yeah, I used to fall asleep in history, and now you read like historical documents for a
Yeah,
living. Uh,
because I find that like the historical narrative that they try to teach in class is like kind of unrelatable. But then like if
mhm,
you're finding things that are actually like interesting and like relatable, then you're like, oh, okay. So that makes sense. Like it doesn't make sense in history classes when they were trying to teach like, Pearl Harbor, but then it doesn't
mhm,
connect to like the grander scheme of thing. And like if there's one thing I would do is to like have people like not learn incidences, like
mhm.
incidents that's like happening in the world, but instead like, learn of it as like a grander scheme. I don't know how like if our brain can like learn like of grander scheme of things,
Mhm.
like the big picture.
Yeah, yeah. So you're bringing up a lot of really good points about how, like, what you learned in school, which is very similar to what I learned in school, also, being in American school, and just like what your grandmother was telling you and you not fully grasping because that was not what you've been told. So, can you share a little bit more about like how Western narratives really overlook and silence stories from World War II in the Asia Pacific region?
Yeah, just like what I was saying about like Pearl Harbor, for
Hmm.
example, right? And then we don't really learn about in the 4 years what had happened between
Hmm.
Pearl Harbor and the end of World War II. And it's just often reduced to like island hopping and then the atomic bomb. And then we don't really know
Hmm.
about the 4 years of like people who suffered, for example, like Bataan Death March that was happening. We don't learn about the occupation of Hong Kong because right after Pearl Harbor was happening, then because of how relatively closer uh, Hawaii was to Hong Kong and the Philippines, and so then they attacked those countries in like
Hmm.
almost in 8 hours within the same day. And then Hong Kong
Wow.
was then handed to Japan by Christmas. And Singapore was also, under Japanese invasion as well. And so we
Wow.
don't talk about this kind of like human suffering within those
Hmm.
4 years when they were being occupied. And it's also very interesting because we were doing oral history interviews with these Filipinas, and they were talking about how when they saw like Japanese people coming to the Philippines because the Philippines was a U.S. colony at the time. So then they were kind of excited about being liberated by their fellow Asians. But then
Hmm.
the Japanese turned out to replace their colonizer in a more brutal way that got them to not got them to be radicalized.
Wow.
And so then they were fighting with the Americans against the Japanese. And I feel like by having such like Western narrative on this, it kind of overshadow a lot of other people's like experience and also
Hmm.
trauma. And also just like 10 years, even 10 years before Pearl Harbor, Manchuria was occupied by Japan and then was turned into Manchukuo. And that, they suffered for like 10 years before Pearl Harbor even happened. And
Yeah.
by looking at history so like in a Western centric way, we forget that when League of Nations was condemning Japan for occupying Manchuria in 1933, they just walked away from the League of Nations, and it kind of showed Hitler and Mussolini that they can just do the same.
Hmm.
And at the same time, like we also look at history in such a Western way that we sideline what Japan had done, but they were actually setting an example of what could be done for the Western world as well.
Wow. Yeah. I just learned so much listening to you talk, but you know, something that I heard in all of that is the Western narrative, and I'm sure other narratives around the world as well, kind of just like I can't remember the exact language you use, but they're like pinpoints in time. It's like this happened and then this happened, but they're missing so
Yes, they're
much in
yes,
between.
they I think it becomes more like incidents
Hmm.
versus like
That's what you
linking
said,
the whole big
incidents.
picture together.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, if there are large gaps of time missing, if you're only highlighting incidents, just like you were describing with your grandmother, people's narratives and lived experiences aren't being heard, or only certain people's narratives or lived experiences are being heard. And therefore, we, as in people learning the history, are only getting a small portion of what
Right.
actually happened.
It's almost like this kind of cultural gaslighting, if you think
Mm,
about it, because then you kind of dismiss this whole entire population
yeah.
experience and their whole like trauma and yeah, and it's like a whole part of history that's eliminated.
Hmm. Yeah. So going off of what you just said, like, what would you say is the impacts of these stories being overlooked, being silenced, being dismissed, whatever words we want to use?
Yeah. So for a lot of, so I want to say like it's different depending on people's experience. For example, we were interviewing these Chinese women in Shanxi, who were comfort women. They were basically like sex slaves for Imperial Japan for like
Wow.
2, 3 years when it was like occupied, and they were like raped like multiple times a day. And these survivors, when I was interviewing them, like they didn't talk about that for decades because it's such a
Hmm.
taboo topic in Asian culture to even go in and talk about that. And they just live for like decades after pretending that nothing even happened.
Wow.
And so they weren't even, it's not that they were just like victims, they were also being like ostracized by their own community. And like for Asian diasporas that we interviewed in California, the Filipinos who were fighting along the Americans against the Japanese, this kind of silence of their experience, like before we interview them, their family members had no idea that's what happened to them and that
Oh
like their
my
wartime
goodness.
experience. And we were so lucky to do it before they even passed away. And
Hmm.
a lot of the I, from what I gathered, I felt like their silence almost made them feel like like a forever foreigner in their
Hmm.
like in this kind of where they're like struggle in their where they were from really didn't matter to this like narrative of their new home. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And the fact that you just said that people that were sharing the stories with you, like, literally had never shared them with anyone
Yeah.
else. Like, the people closest to them had no idea that that was their lived experience. I would imagine, you know, because these stories were silenced by Western narratives, by what people were taught, they didn't feel like they could even
Right.
share the stories.
Exactly. And it doesn't fit into the narratives, right? Because a lot of what we learn in World War II is like the Holocaust education. I'm not saying that, we don't need to learn the Holocaust education, but
Hmm.
I'm saying that, like, for example, if my grandma was sharing with me her Holocaust experience, right? Then I would
Hmm.
have believed her a lot more than if she's just like, oh, stop watching anime. This is creating brain rot. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's like also as a child, then it shaped this narrative in my mind without me like realizing that the narrative
Hmm.
was already shaped.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would imagine, you know, for your grandma, and I don't know your grandma, obviously, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but just like looking at it through a trauma lens, if someone's narrative has been silenced and they don't feel like they can speak up
Right.
about that narrative, their lived experience is still going to come out in different ways. So for your
Yeah.
grandma, it was telling you to stop watching anime because it's rot, but she didn't explain why that
Right.
was because I'm sure sharing her lived experience or her Holocaust experience, as you just described it, was much more challenging and much more vulnerable than just being like, Jenny, stop watching anime.
Yeah. Exactly. I think you're right.
Yeah. And so we've been saying the word trauma a lot, and the atrocities that you are describing are collective traumas. So, what would you say is the human cost of these collective traumas? Like, how do these collective traumas impact people? What themes have you seen come up in the interviews you've done? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, so I think trauma isn't just like a physical thing.
Hmm.
I think it's also like a destruction of this like trust and community and like moral architecture of a society. So when Japan was occupying Manchuria, like what I was saying, they were also establishing a human experimentation lab called Unit 731 in
Okay.
Manchuria. And they did human experimentation and like it was in a way, and then they just collected all these victims and then they call them logs, and there's like no surviving victims um because they were doing and to desensitize themselves doing this kind of human experimentation. They call them maruta, which was log. And it's I feel like when I was reading that, it kind of felt like this kind of systematic way to strip away a person's name or story and then
Hmm.
just use it as kind of a data point. And I think that really it destruct the whole moral architecture of a society when
Hmm.
people are just stripped to like a data point.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I'm sure we'll touch on this at some point in our conversation, but we've seen that happen in other historical things that we've
Yes.
learned about, where people are, just a number or, like you
They're
said,
lesser.
exactly, a data point. And yeah, it strips away the humanness, which in it of itself, I would say is a trauma because your
Yes.
whole identity is being stripped away from you. Let's not even like we're not even touching on what is happening to these people, but being treated as less than, being stripped of your humanness, um, not allowing to be able to speak, act, or whatever in certain ways because you have been boiled down to a data point can be trauma within itself.
Right, exactly. And also if you think about it too, just like then the stories that that we eventually find out, right? And eventually Unit 731 was a due to the Cold War, and then like later the scientists signed on for immunity
Hmm.
for with the United States to in exchange. They signed on basically to with the United States to get immunity after
Hmm.
the war. And so then there's a lot of like victor justice, and also like people people who were victims of this
Hmm.
kind of aggression, and also like of this kind of discrimination, thinking that they're less than, have no kind of way to heal if you think about
Mm-hmm.
it. And it's just collective. And so I think it leads to a lot of like what I saw in my grandma, anger and also like, lashing out when I was watching anime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm so glad you just brought up the fact that there's really no way to heal. Because one thing I was thinking about is in what you were just talking about a few moments ago with the logs and how there was no survivors. Like all of those people went through a collective trauma together, and there is absolutely no way to process it because there are no survivors. Or what we were talking about earlier, where people have been silenced or their stories have been overlooked, even if they did go through this with other people, if the narrative that they were told, either explicitly or implicitly, is that your story doesn't matter, they're not going to be able to process or talk about that, even with probably the people that went through it with them.
Exactly. And it's interesting because like a lot of the I would say that like Japan still has a Yasukuni shrine that kind of honor, war criminals, class A war
Mm,
criminals. So imagine if like Nazi Germany had that kind of
yeah.
shrine to enshrine, right? And so then it leads to also a lot of I was vacationing in Korea, and my
Hmm.
Airbnb host was like, "Oh, you want to join me in like protesting the Japanese embassy today?" And they're like, and it's like a Wednesday. I'm like, "Oh, okay." Like, but it's like a cultural thing that they do. They like protest the Japanese embassy because they were colonized by Japan for so long that this is their way to like gather, to kind of heal collectively,
Hmm.
which I thought
Hmm.
was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it does sound like they're trying to find ways to heal collectively, which is good.
yeah.
I like how you're like, it was just a Wednesday. Just on vacation. Um, and I mean, I hope more people, especially with the work you're doing and people telling their stories, that will allow more people to heal. But, with any type of collective trauma, even though you logically know other people are going through it, it can still be extremely difficult to talk about or even know where to start when it comes to talking about what you've been through.
Yeah, and it's also so we had this survivor who, have been very supportive since we started the organization. And one time we basically partnered up with the Holocaust Center, and we did Day of Learning with the Day of Learning with the Holocaust Center, and I was asking her to lecture. And she was like, "Oh, I don't know if I can do that." Like, and she ended up coming. The first time she shared her experience, she was crying, and she was
Hmm.
crying so, like, I didn't even know what to do. And apparently, she was a professor at Sonoma State. And so after the war, she kind of just forgot about what had happened to her. She had lost her younger brother due to starvation during
Wow.
the war. And so she kind of just tried to suppress that kind of memory.
Hmm.
And just for and when her late husband brought her to the movie theater to watch a World War II movie, she was crying so hard that like her husband had to carry her from the movie theater
Wow.
seat to the car. And so then when she was talking, the first time she like shared her experience with like this classroom, she was crying so hard I didn't know what to do. And like it's been like 10 years that since she's been like now sharing it continuously through our
Hmm.
internship program and also like other opportunities that I get to bring her to show with like classrooms and younger generation what she had went through. And last year we had a conference and she just shed like a tear. I think even for her, she's like healing
Yeah.
um, of what she experienced during the war.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that speaks to the power of sharing your story. It's not obviously easy, but over time, more people you can share it with, and the more people that can hear you and believe you, um, that storytelling is
Yes.
innately healing.
And I think that's like what humans are meant to do. Like we're meant to tell each other stories. We're meant to,
Hmm.
have shared collective experiences, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully not just traumatic ones, because I know that's what we've been talking about. But yeah,
Yeah,
and I mean that human connectedness is so healing. And like, and I don't know this woman's, specific circumstances, but tying it back to what we were just talking about, like, if we have human connectedness, that is the opposite of being silenced, overlooked, only bonded through trauma. So the connectedness, through storytelling, through mutual experience, through just like laughter and love and things like that can be healing, even if the person you're connecting with has not gone through the same thing as you
right.
have.
Yeah,
So we've been talking about trauma a lot. Obviously, a lot of impacts of trauma, and you've shared some great stories. How would you say historical trauma can inform present day mental health?
yeah, I think so. I think like what I think a lot of like younger generation don't realize like what they have lived through with like an
Mhm.
elderly who had gone through that kind of historical trauma. Like I had no idea what my grandma
Yeah,
was saying. And like, now that I think about it, it gets I'm like, wow, I reflect on it. I'm like, huh, that changed me in any shape or form. And
yeah.
like I think so because then like I started getting more curious about what had happened to her. And also like, it also and then when search about how she survived through those terrible times, it kind of also give me this kind of like blueprint for like endurance in a
Hmm.
way, right? And then it also builds empathy for what she had gone through, and it's not like
Hmm.
she was just lashing out.
Yeah,
It's yeah, it's like it kind of in my mind formed this kind of legacy of like survivorship, if that makes sense.
absolutely. Well, and I think you touched on a lot of great things there. First and foremost, like younger generations may not understand or may have not gone through what our grandparents went through, but we're still impacted in one way or another through the trauma they
Right,
experience. And I mean, there is like evidence that trauma can be passed down genetically, it's encoded different. But even in the example you were giving with like your grandmother's trauma presenting as anger or lashing out, that's going to impact you as her granddaughter with how she acts around you. And
right.
it sounds like obviously it wasn't until after she passed away that you could kind of piece together maybe why she was um, acting in the way she was. And you said you developed empathy for her and more understanding of why she did. But her trauma still
Yeah.
impacted you and probably your relationship, maybe the way you viewed your grandma, maybe your own mental health as well. And I'm sure that's the same for so many other people who's maybe have not gone through collective trauma or traumas themselves, but are impacted by the traumas of previous generations.
Yeah, I believe so. And recently I interviewed this guy whose father was a part of like the Imperial Japanese Army.
Oh, wow.
And he told me that his father was suffering through PTSD every night, like would have nightmares and whatnot. And he was wondering like how, and then he found like this family album where his father was actually like smiling and is like a happy guy before the war started, and he was wondering like how his father was before
Hmm.
the war, and he was wondering like how a lot of these Japanese soldiers, they come back and they get like they have to like, you know, live this new life now. And yeah, they he was wondering like if he felt this way about his father, so many people his age must have felt that way about their own fathers too, about if they had not fought the war, how would
Hmm.
they have acted? Would they have been nicer? Would And this is like a time before people even realized what PTSD was.
Yeah.
When World War II ended, no one knew what PTSD was, and people just move on. They just don't talk
Hmm.
about it anymore, and they have just moved on over it.
Yeah. Well, and I think you just brought up a really good point there is, I asked the question of like, how does historical trauma inform present day mental health? But our conceptualization of mental health is so different than it was back then.
Yeah.
So like you just said, we didn't talk about PTSD or mental health. I mean, and some people still don't talk about mental health, but we as a whole are talking about it more. And so if somebody came back from the war, a completely changed person because of the traumas they witnessed, the violence, the atrocities, and they were just meant to, okay, reintegrate into civilian life and go on about your day. They're not getting help and support to manage the mental health. And like you described with your grandma, it's going to come out as lashing out, or this man who you were talking about, dad's having nightmares. And just based on what you were saying, it sounds like maybe the relationship wasn't that great
Right.
with how um, dad was after the war. And I think that's another thing for all of us to consider when we're thinking about like historical trauma, generational trauma, is conceptualizations of trauma and mental health and resources available are so different now than they
Yes,
were in previous generations.
definitely.
So obviously we've been talking a lot about, you know, collective trauma, the negative consequences of such. We've talked PTSD, anger, people feeling like they can't talk about or share their stories. So kind of shifting to maybe a more positive end of things, like why would you say, one, it is important to remember these difficult histories, but two, how can acknowledging, remembering, learning about them actually aid in our self-growth and resilience?
Yeah, I think just like when I was talking about the survivor that comes and share that's been coming to our events and sharing about her experience, I can see like healing and like grow from that experience
Mhm.
of her alone. And she's like, she must be in her 90s now. I think about this.
Oh my gosh.
And she is still and she is still like and I saw that like happening in like this old age, and
Hmm.
it's kind of really touching to see that,
Yeah.
because you don't think about transformation at your older age. You don't think about
Hmm.
healing at your older age, right? But then that kind of transformation is really like r- sharing the truth of what had happened to her, and like, you know and really sharing that out there is leading to this kind of transformation that I think
Hmm.
is helping a lot, in terms of healing. And also I think that healing requires like acknowledgement, and also you can't acknowledge if you don't even know what had happened, right? Like, what
Yeah.
is never again if the first time was never told? And so I think that healing it is provided by just telling the truth.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I agree with your statement that healing can't happen without acknowledgement. Because if we don't acknowledge things that happen, whether on a collective scale or acknowledgement in our personal life, we can't
Yeah,
process and move forward with them.
right. Yeah,
And also by without acknowledging it, we're reinforcing what we talked about earlier, which is overlooking and silencing
yeah,
the experiences of individuals whose stories aren't told. Um, and yeah, the power of storytelling, which I know we already highlighted. And one thing I was thinking about that I know you already mentioned this earlier, but you know, you mentioned after your grandma died and learning more, you developed more empathy for her. So even though you haven't experienced these specific traumas that your grandma went through, learning about them aided in your self growth
yes,
as well.
definitely. Right. I think so. And also, I think that, like, by acknowledging and learning, I feel like we can prevent a lot of, atrocities in the future. Because
Hmm.
atrocities don't really start with like killing. I think it starts with like language, right? Like
Mm.
when you start saying that someone's lesser than you, and that's like historically, that's how they get, mass killings done when they start saying like, oh, this group of people are lesser than certain group of
Hmm.
people. And yeah, it's and also by teaching this kind of process, like, we can also show like early warning signs. And we also can like train the next generation to spot dehumanization early.
Hmm. Yeah. I love that you just highlighted that atrocities don't start with killing and that it is, because if they did, like, we would probably address things differently if that was the first sign. But, you know, it's usually there's usually way more steps before that. Like you said, the othering, the dehumanization, putting people down. Um, Even I'm thinking of like discrimination and using stereotypes and the ways that we other people to make them less than. And then I love social media in many ways, but I also think social media can readily attribute or contribute to that othering of people.
I
Um,
know, it's crazy, especially now. I'm like watching this all go down. I'm like, wow, imagine if you're like Jewish and you're like watching these like
mhm.
social media comments, like just lumping everyone together.
Yeah, no, it is. No, it is. It's like because we all
And
have
it's so
access to information.
and and it's so easy on social media to just label certain groups of people together. And then
Hmm.
because they're doing it on like their mobile device, or like a lot of people have like, fake accounts, then they feel like they can hide behind the username.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But and bring that up just because like that is another way these patterns are being repeated. And yeah, it like you said, it doesn't start with a killing, but it starts with othering. And I love that you also said we can teach future generations how to spot these things because I think that's so important as well. Because I mean, and I fully admit we both talked about this. We fell asleep during history class. I was definitely the teenager in high school that was like, why do I need to learn this? The past is in the past. And now, as an adult with a fully developed frontal lobe, I realize that if we don't learn about history, it will literally repeat itself. We can see patterns across different types of collective traumas and atrocities that the same pattern presents, even if it's in different parts of the world.
Correct. I agree.
Yeah. So, kind of on that vein, we've kind of talked about healing from historical wounds on an individual level already, but are there other ways that we can heal from these historical wounds? And what steps do you believe we need to take to ensure that these tragedies don't happen again or to reduce the likelihood that similar tragedies will happen in the future?
To be honest with you, my hopes are not that high anymore. As
I
I
appreciate the
watch,
honesty. Honestly,
as
I
I
appreciate
watch
it.
the Middle East, and then like people are fighting on social media with this group versus this other group. And I feel like I'm watching like two Karens at a McDonald's, fighting. And then I'm like, I'm just going to go to the drive-through.
I love that analogy.
Like
Okay.
I don't even fall within the two camps. What are you guys talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think starting with what you said is like teaching future generations how to actually spot these behaviors
Yeah,
is a starting point. I know we keep talking about social media, so I think media literacy needs to be taught. And I know social media is just like it's not the
yeah.
real world, but it does perpetuate the spread of these harmful rhetorics, or even it helps silence people. That was one of the first themes we were talking about.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so. Like, yeah, and it doesn't provide any context. And then if you
mhm,
talk about then your lived experience, then they're like, "Oh, that's not true, blah blah blah. This is not correct." And then there's like a whole bunch of like bots, or maybe they're
mhm,
real people, but maybe there's like a whole social group that do that, but like
mhm,
it's insane. For example, I was sharing like comfort women on Instagram, and then there would be like these troll accounts that were like, oh no, they were like high paid prostitutes and blah blah blah. And it's like, wow, it's
mhm.
yeah, it's I don't know. I think social media is its own game.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. But I guess another thing, I know I asked you the question, you kind of put it back on me, but and I'm not just saying this because you're my guest on, but I think, people doing work like you do, where you're sharing stories that are not being told. And my hope, and maybe I'm too optimistic, is that if we actually start sharing the real history and not just like the whitewashed, appropriate for high school, whatever AP test, whatever history, um, that will help people and future generations identify like, oh, okay, I wasn't taught this, but now I'm learning more about the truth. What else wasn't I taught and
I think
told?
s- I think it's a good point. And like I think a lot of teachers try to filter a lot of things for their students. And I'm not saying that's like a wrong thing to do, Sometimes we need to be sensitive. But
Hmm.
like high school students can actually endure and like, and find out the truth on social media and also on the internet. So we had like a group of high school students who reached out to us about, Unit 731, and they made a documentary and they won first place in
Wow.
New Mexico at the National History Day, which was like, and then no one, like, all of the judges had no idea what Unit 731 was. And they kind of just wanted to share the story because they were like, wow, this is some kind of thing that we had never learned in school as well. And like we had only learned like 90% Hitler from our from our
Yeah.
education. And so then they wanted to bring this kind of, broader global history to light.
Hmm.
It to
Yeah.
say, and I think that's very encouraging. And I think our younger people are more resilient than we think.
Hmm. Oh, I completely agree with that statement. I always say I think like Gen Z is really gonna change the world because they are resilient, and I feel like as much as social media can be bad, as we've indicated, I do see a lot of younger generations getting more involved, challenging authority, not in a bad way, but like saying like, "Hey, I don't think that's right." Finding the truths in these histories and things like that. Things that I know when I was a teenager, I was definitely not doing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay. Well, Jenny, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I have learned a lot from you. I'm taking notes on like things I have to go research and look up. But as we are wrapping up, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you would like to touch on, or maybe something that we touched on earlier but you wanted to expand on?
No, I don't really have anything. And if people want to find out more, they can go on our website, pacificatrocities.org.
That's what I was going to ask as my last question is where can people connect with you? So, pacificatrocities.org. And also, I know you mentioned your YouTube channel, Pacific Front Untold, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Any other places people connect with you or things that you have coming up?
Instagram, but please do not leave any mean comments and troll.
I love it. I love the boundary setting. Um, okay. And Instagram as well, but no trolls are welcome. I love it. I love it. Well,
Yeah.
Jenny, thank you so much for coming on, having this conversation. I'll link all of that in the show notes of this episode so people can find you all. Like I said, I learned a lot from you. I wrote down notes on things that I have to go look up and educate myself on. But I appreciate the work you're doing and bringing these stories to light and how, you know, you are helping people heal from their trauma through telling their stories and then in turn helping educate so many of us on the stories that we weren't told or the gaps that were missing. So I just appreciate you being here and I appreciate all the knowledge you shared.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, the listeners, for joining for today's episodes of Psych Talk. And I will catch you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Psych Talk. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. Don't forget to follow me on all socials at Jessica Lee, PhD, and the podcast at Psych Talk Podcast on Instagram.